Thank you, Virginia. As always, appreciate the opportunity. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Boccadoro. I serve as Executive Director of Dairy Cares here in California. And for those of you who are not familiar with Dairy Cares, it's a now over 20-year sustainability coalition that involves the entire dairy sector here in the state, producers, processors, cooperatives, working together on sustainability issues across the board. And methane has been a big focus in large part because we've got a significant and very ambitious methane pledge here in California, actually a mandate that we are trying to achieve. So as Virginia said, we've got some very good panelists to talk about some of the supply chains. But before we do that, I did want to just do a little bit to talk perspective for folks and kind of set the stage for the discussion today. And I think it's really important for people to understand, and you've seen this slide a few times today, so I apologize. Here in the state, agriculture is about 7% when you exclude forestry in the inventory of all greenhouse gases. But we're a full 55% when you include dairy and other livestock, primarily beef cattle here in the state, of all the methane in the state. So we are the primary source of methane, and so reducing not only manure methane, which we've been working now for a couple of years, but now starting to tackle enteric is critically important, which is one of the reasons why I asked the question a few moments ago. We need to make a dent in enteric if there's any chance. We're going to probably overproduce on the manure side, so if there's any chance, we do need some reduction in enteric as well. So it's critically important, and it's critically important to understand it's not just the dairy sector. A lot of the focus has been on the dairy sector, but I think when you start looking at U.S. and global emissions, you recognize that enteric is a much larger share of the total methane emissions from dairy and livestock in the U.S. and globally than it is here in California. And so it makes it even more important what we're trying to achieve in terms of enteric reductions. And if we can achieve them, anybody can, because we are one of the most efficient places to produce. We heard the question about efficiency a few moments ago, and Anna actually, one of Dr. Kabraev's post-grad students, actually calculated the number for us a few years ago. If the rest of the world became as efficient as California at producing dairy, it would achieve 1.8% total GHG reductions across the globe. Think about that. That's twice as important as California getting its emissions to zero. So it's a really, really important point for us to be thinking about. And so to provide a little perspective about the supply chain, this was very eye-opening for me, and I think it'll be eye-opening for this discussion. Cradle to farm gate, the farm, is a significant portion of the supply chain for a typical dairy product. It's huge. In the calculation here, it's 72%, but it's easily 3/4, and in some cases, I've seen it get as high as 80%, depending upon the product, whether it's beef or dairy. Critically important that we understand that as we seek to consider what some of these food companies have set out for their own goals and how they're going to be achieved. To look at it a slightly different way is to look at it as scope 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see, that scope 3, which is the farm and some of the other purchased goods and services, so the supply chain, is 68% for a typical food company. Massive, absolutely massive. So as you look at the goals for some of these food companies, 50% carbon reduction by 2030 across their supply chain. For Starbucks, very similar for Nestle with an interim goal of 20% by 2025. McDonald's, a 31% reduction in carbon emission intensity. Chipotle, a 50% carbon reduction across their supply chain. It's really easy to understand that these food companies cannot, under any circumstances, achieve their goals by looking at their own emissions. They have to look backwards in the supply chain at the farm, and the farm is critically important. So I just want to underscore as we enter into this discussion today the importance of enteric in this discussion, and it may be more important than manure when you consider the global perspective. So we've got some great speakers to discuss this, and I'm going to provide a brief introduction of the speakers, and I'm going to ask them an initial question that they can either do from their seat or they can come up here to the podium if they prefer. But first, I'm going to go to Vrashabh Vrashabh Kapate, who's the manager of dairy industry at Environmental Defense Fund, and in this role, he leads their engagement with the dairy industry across the globe, partnering with them to drive ambitious climate action spanning across the supply chain. He holds a Master's of Public Affairs from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering. So, Vrashabh, the question I want to ask you is, please provide us with a brief overview of the supply chain challenges and opportunities associated with enteric emissions.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to UC Davis and California Department of Food and Agriculture for organizing this summit and having me as a speaker. My name is Vrashabh Kapate, and I lead Environmental Defense Fund's engagement with the dairy industry to drive ambitious climate action. For those of you who are not familiar, Environmental Defense Fund is a global nonprofit that looks for pragmatic, science-based solutions to the environmental and climate challenges. We recognize the importance of methane and the critical role it can play as a short-lived climate pollutant, and believe that reducing methane emissions now will put us on the fastest path to avoid catastrophic impacts of climate change. Talking about today's topic, food and ag companies have a crucial role to play in reducing emissions from agriculture. Good news is that many companies have set targets and are implementing them. However, the speed and scale at which we want enteric solutions to be taken up, we need to engage all nodes within the supply chain, ranging from farmers and ranchers on one end to consumers on the other. And so we need to get buy-in from all these three nodes. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities in terms of enteric emission solutions at each of these nodes. Starting with farmers and ranchers, understanding the challenges and needs of farmers is extremely crucial, because many of these solutions have to be, at the end of the day, be deployed at the farm and by farmers. So we worked with the Context Network and surveyed 400 dairy and beef producers across the US to understand their perspective towards enteric solutions and the opportunities around them. And some challenges emerged. The first challenge is around incentives. Less than 30% of the farmers said they would be willing to bear the economic cost of enteric solutions, even if they were reasonably priced. The other challenge is around innovation. Many of the promising solutions that have been coming to the fore have limited applicability in the grazing context, and therefore that leave out a significant portion of enteric methane to be tackled. However, there are opportunities. When farmers were asked about what would be the key driver which will lead to uptake, they highlighted improved productivity and premium price for low carbon products, which essentially nod to innovation through improved productivity or finding incentives, either financial or operational, that will lead to uptake. Coming to the second node, which is processors and food companies, more and more companies are realizing the material impact that climate change will have on their business. They are facing increasing pressure from investors, employees, and consumers to bake climate action within their strategy. Here's a non-exhaustive list of companies that have set science-based target and are taking action. However, challenges remain. One of the key challenges is around finance. In the case where there is no increase in productivity, companies will need to find incentives to drive adoption within the supply chain. And the second is around measurement and reporting. We've spoken about data all through the day. As the solution space is evolving, there is a need for integrating the upcoming solutions within existing monitoring tools, so that allows for simpler data collection for farmers, robust determination of emission reduction across the supply chain, and which also allow for meeting best practices set by voluntary standards like GHG protocol. There are opportunities in innovative finance. The nature of supply chains and Scope 3 accounting allow for players within the supply chain to come together, pool resources, deploy solutions within their supply chain, and then take credit for these interventions. In addition to that, there is also the opportunity through blended finance. We've heard about this, that the Inflation Reduction Act added $19.5 billion, and the outlay for one particular program, the RCPP, went up from $400 million to $1.6 billion annually. Environmental Defense Fund recently released a report on climate smart agriculture activation guide in association with Deloitte, which is now available. And that report lays out this particular program and more. In addition to that, there are some more steps that companies can take. They can set an ambitious methane reduction target, which will essentially signal to the market that enteric methane solution is a growing sector and full of opportunities. They can build incentive structures. They can trial available solutions once they are available to prove efficacy and safety at scale. And finally, invest in innovation, both at the research side, but also once these prototypes are available, ensuring that they are available commercially. Finally, talking about consumers, Environmental Defense Fund does not generally engage with consumers, but as we've heard before, consumer perception towards enteric solutions can make or break adoption within the supply chain. So we worked with Globespan to look at few interventions across the whole set of possible interventions, ranging from masks, natural synthetic feed additives, and surveyed 2,000 consumers across the US. This study is still underway, but I wanted to share certain preliminary findings. And not surprisingly, consumers are concerned about safety. And they believe that interventions that are perceived to be safe will be the ones that will be supported the most. And so therefore, there is a leaning towards natural feed additives for their perceived notion of being safe. However, this creates an opportunity for setting the message. And so when asked about what would be the trusted channels, they identified farmers and ranchers, regulators, and scientific body to be the trusted channel. And so there is an opportunity to, once these products have demonstrated safety and efficacy, that message is then legitimized through these trusted channels. And craft the message in such a way that talks about the benefits of these products rather than being a detractor for consumers. Finally, I'd like to say that there is a need for solutions through research and development that are safe, not just on human health, but also on animal health, that have proven efficacy and show methane reduction potential and hopefully even increase productivity. And finally, we need these solutions to be deployed fast, and there is a final opportunity here where we can build the infrastructure for creating the modes of development so that once these solutions are commercially available, we can deploy them fast. There is a need for concerted efforts across nodes within the supply chain because this is an opportunity we can't afford to miss. Thank you. And I look forward to the conversation with my panelists.
Next, I'm going to turn to Jennifer with Barry Callebaut. And then Jennifer, if you can give us a little bit about Barry Callebaut and some of the things you're working on. Lots of goals being set. How are the global food companies going to achieve them?
Yeah, hello everyone. Is that working? Okay. So my name is Jennifer Bockhahn. I work with Barry Callebaut, and we have a lot of initiatives going on right now to reduce our Scope 3 emissions because it's our largest footprint behind land use change is dairy specifically. So a lot of the focus we've been working on is methane. And being a B2B company, a lot of the customers we sell to also have goals to reduce their methane emissions. So we work in conjunction with them to reduce those emissions. One of our main focuses right now is reducing enteric. So we have created a carbon credit project through Vera that started out that way, and then we utilized the feed additive Agilin, and we have scaled that up to over 100 farms across the United States. And I say this started out as a carbon credit project because I think one really important factor that we're not discussing here today is we're talking a lot about the science and we're not talking about how the science plays into the accounting. So that's a big bridge that we're always working with, that greenhouse gas protocol and SBT both cover, but are constantly in flux. So when we're talking about carbon insets, that's actually a term that companies aren't even interested in anymore. We're now moved on to carbon claims. And there's a lot of progression that's happening in the industry and what companies are looking for because of what they can legally account for under the SBTI rules. So I'll say that a lot of us are making progress, and I think it's really important to pay attention to the connection of the accounting, especially when it comes to the different protocols baselines. I know there's a lot of concerns around there about where the baseline will be determined, and that's stopping farmers from making progress. So we need to set where the baseline is going to be and what progress is measured as. Is it intensity? Is it an absolute reduction? These are all different ways of accounting, and the science has to play into that with our solutions. And then I'll also say that, in all of that, just flex with the change. There's a lot happening all the time, and I don't think it's moving as slow as, we all think it is. There's a lot of progress out there. I work with at least 6 CPGs that have enteric projects they're starting. This is happening. So, it's all out there.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer. You got me on? Thank you, Jennifer. We're next going to turn to Leah Wilkinson with the American Feed Industry Association. And Leah, share with us a little bit about what the feed industry's role in all of this related to enteric methane.
Sure, and I've got to hold the button down, correct? Is that right? Okay, all right, good. Make me talk faster or shorter. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm Leah Wilkinson with the American Feed Industry Association, so maybe a little bit different perspective. We're a trade association that represents the entire feed industry. So we have membership that represent feed manufacturers, pet food manufacturers, feed ingredient suppliers, as well as the companies that make the equipment that we use in our industry. So we represent the entire industry, and we are their voice in legislative and regulatory international trade policy issues, and then provide education, networking opportunities for our industry as well. In this space, I think we really are try to have ourselves be seen as a resource and a partner for the entire industry to be able to assist not only our industry, but also our stakeholders and customers of our products to be able to meet the goals that have either been set for them or that they have set themselves in the environment space. But then I think we're all here too, right? Because we need to continue to provide those safe, nutritious, wholesome products that protect human health, animal health, and the environment. So from an AFIA perspective, we have worked in a couple of different areas, and I'll touch lightly on all of them, and we will probably get to all of them in the Q&A. The biggest challenge has been on the regulatory side, and the ability to be able to get products to the market in a predictable manner, and in a pathway that is appropriate for the type of product and how it works in the animal. And so right now in this space, and if there's an environmental claim that wants to be made, those products would be regulated as an animal drug. And we think if it's working in the digestive tract, that there's a pathway that they could be regulated as a feed ingredient. And that's a big change in the approval process. It's still not easy to get a feed ingredient approved, I will tell you that, and we've been working on that as well. But it is something that is more appropriate in a feed pathway than as a drug pathway for products, again, that are working within the digestive tract. So we're working on that, and then also at the same time making sure that FDA has the resources that they need to be able to review those products for us. The other part then is, as we're working on that with FDA, and is making sure that we start talking about how can we get these products into the hands of producers. And you heard from Undersecretary Bonnie today about some of the USDA programs that could be there and some of the funding. There is currently a feed management standard that's there under the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Has anybody heard of that program before? One hand, Perry. So it's a program that's been there mostly for nutrient management plans and manure management. It hasn't been used since 2014, which is as far back as the public database for NRCS goes, and likely hasn't been used beyond that as well. There are 7 technical experts in the United States that are certified to be able to write feed management standards and plans right now. And so we've got a lot to do to bring that standard up to date, to be able to talk about animal nutrition as a whole and the role that that can play with livestock producers and conservation. But then also to how do we start to incorporate some of these ingredients that, as they get approved, can be tools that producers could use and could receive some cost share or incentive dollars to be able to have their use. So we're having those conversations. We need to update, we need training, we need expertise, lots of things to build that. And that's something that we're looking to partner with USDA to help with. And quickly, from a feed management and manufacturing sector, we have companies that have a full gamut of plans and their roadmap for sustainability. And we have a foundation, iFeeder, it's the Institute for Feed Education and Research, that is helping our industry along this path. And we've developed a toolkit. We've done phase 1 that producers can really use to help them on this pathway and what's appropriate for their systems. We're working on phase 2, which is going to get more into some of the data and how do we measure and report things, and then how do we quantify these benefits and talk about them when we're talking about specific ingredients or our ration management and things like that. And then briefly, the International Feed Industry Federation, so this take AFIA and take it to a global scale. That is our worldwide feed association that has a group that's looking at nutritional innovation. And that space really was put together not because of the environment, but it's more about, we knew that there needs to be some education and work about the role of animal nutrition and how that helps in production and improving and optimizing not only animal production, but then human health around the world. So there's different components to that, but we know that we can do more from a feed manufacturing perspective to optimize our manufacturing practices, the composition of our feed, the way we deliver that feed to our producers and to the animals that can help provide that adequate nutrition. We know that there's a role that we can play on minimizing exposure of stressors in the feed to the animal. We can better make sure we're covering all of the animal's nutritional needs and making sure we're supporting that specific stage of life that that animal is in. And we're working through a definition of adequate nutrition. We've got some practices that have been put through a system, and a lot of data that's going to be coming, a lot more communication that's going to be coming out there that can be used in developing countries, as well as in our developed world too, that can really help spread that word of the role of animal nutrition and animal production to help in this space too.
Thank you, Leah. I want to go back. Jennifer, you mentioned Agalin that you're working with currently at Barry Callebaut. What other feed additives are commercially available, and what outlook do you have for additional feed additive availability?
Agalin is the only feed additive I'm aware of that's currently for use at scale within the United States. We are, aware that other ones are working their way through the regulatory system, such as 3-NOP, there's seaweed, there's other options out there. I mean, Cargill even had something called Silver for a second, but there's it's a slow process, and I am hesitant with many of the feed additives that are still working their way through the process. We've done research on lots of these globally, so, and we've worked with a lot of institutions to, all of the researchers that have spoken here today, to see what the efficacy is of all of these options. But as of now, we're working solely with Agilent, and we'll see what comes out as we go. But I'm mostly interested in the stackability of products like Agilent, rather than a complete transition away from it. The reason being it's a reduction that is within reason. It's not pushing anything beyond what I believe the animal's gut being able to handle. And it increases production. So, it's not something we're convincing farmers to be a part of. Farmers are using the product, and we are helping them with set up an MRV, set up the claims, set up the kind of data they need to report and collect on. So the system already exists almost.
Thank you. And Vrashabh, I'm going to turn back to you. Talk to us a little bit about what the entire supply chain can do to encourage product availability going forward, and which players need to get involved.
I think there is a role for each of these players to play, starting from the panel that was before us, talking about research and talking about the areas that are showing promise, like dairy, but also looking at beef and the applicability in grazing. Can we get improvement in productivity, which then becomes an easier pathway for farmers to adopt some of these solutions? In terms of companies, there is an incentive structure that they can set up, which will drive some of this adoption. There's also a role for policymakers and how the regulatory process is set up. While it is important to highlight safety and efficacy of these products, can there be a pathway that brings some of these products to commercial applicability at the speed at which we need them? And then finally, are we able to convey that message in a way that is palatable to consumers, that they support these additives and solutions rather than have a negative perception towards them? So I think there is a role for each of the players across the supply chain to play. And like I said, there needs to be concerted efforts from all of them.
Leah, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you highlighted a few from the fact of the speed of innovation that is there and getting it in the hands. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. But being able to have our policymakers understand that what the desire is and the need for these products, and being able to talk with a collective voice is an important part of being able to achieve some of the changes that we're needing, especially when you're talking about the speed and why being able to get products to the market in a faster manner is needed. And we haven't even talked about how we're kind of behind the rest of the world in that category, but we are for some of the ingredients.
Thank you. I want to turn a little bit to a slightly different topic. We've talked a lot about availability, we talked a little bit about adoption, but on the adoption side, we hear a lot about incentives. And so maybe we'll start with Jennifer. What are the key incentives as you see it? You've talked a little bit about the monetary incentives that you're providing. What else is out there, and how important are the incentives to adoption?
So there's a lot of talk out there about dairy farms taking up any sustainability practice. There's corporations throwing out the typical, farmer-centric approach, or, peer-to-peer approach, and people are trying to use trusted networks to get in, things like that. But in my experience, it all really does just come down to, is this good for the farmer and his business? And that can include an environmental aspect that makes their business more resilient and does give them some sort of income through the incentive. But a lot of it is just taking the time to educate and talk with a farmer. They are not caught up always on the different scopes of emissions and why they're even being asked to reduce. And so often just taking the time and not just throwing money at the problem as an incentive is an important part. And I think a lot of education needs to happen, and a lot of farmers will be on board just through that channel. And then when it comes to incentives, farmers aren't dumb. I mean, they've run their own businesses, they've built them up, they've fought some of the crazy economic markets they have to deal with all the time. So when it comes to an incentive, I mean, you can't cut them short. You can't cut out 0.25% of what the value is. You need to give them the full value almost of what is there, and whatever you are taking out needs to be transparent. They're smart and intelligent people, and they could figure it out themselves if they needed to. So a lot of the incentive is trust and transparency.
Vrashabh, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think ROI is critical for farmers in terms of adoption. If they are able to see any productivity gains, that's a big plus. But we also need to match or add up the other costs like labor, the additional, in terms of mode of delivery, what does that look like, and what is the additional effort that farmers need to put into these enteric solutions. And in terms of the incentives, I think we've seen there is a role for the government to play in terms of, we've seen some incentives in equipment CSP early on. Is that a pathway where some of these incentives can come through? That's a question that we could explore. The other is around supply chain incentives. As companies are setting science-based targets and have ambitious targets to reach net zero by 2050, are they willing to foot the bill in case there are no productivity gains? Are consumers willing to pay an additional premium that will drive some of these solutions to be adopted? And then finally, I think there is also the carbon markets. That could be a potential pathway for incentives. However, we need to be careful in terms of what is the additional burden again in terms of what farmers need to do when they enter into these markets. What do the contracts say, and how does a small farmer be able to participate in some of these programs which are so heavy on record keeping or measurement and MRV. So I think that's a full suite of incentives that we could explore.
Thank you. And I'm going to take a slightly different tack. He mentioned potential government subsidies, and maybe, Leah, this is more in your wheelhouse. What are the chances of getting some government subsidies in the upcoming farm bill that could provide significant incentives for farmers to adopt enteric feed additives?
So I think as we're looking at the farm bill space, there is a set pot of money that will go towards conservation programs in general. Whether that gets dedicated within there for specific practices or not will depend upon the political wills that happen. But there is usually some language that tries to drive equality in some of those dollars a little bit more towards livestock production than there had been in the past. And so that's how we've been trying to talk about this as another potential solution for our livestock industry to be able to make use of those conservation dollars. I think with the IRA money that was mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act money, that puts a good chunk of resources that are available for this, if we can get all of those other things tweaked to make the system work better for our feed additives. The part, though, that I think we all need to remember is that with those dollars, Congress and the administration want to be able to show that they have done something for the environment with those dollars. And so being able to measure and show progress will be a key driver for how they want to dedicate those dollars. And I think we've got a great story to be able to tell in this area if we can get all of those things streamlined.
You mentioned federal government and the Farm Bill, or at least I mentioned federal government and the Farm Bill. And this is a question for EDF. Is there also a role for state governments to play in adding to the incentives that farmers might receive to at least be early adopters of feed additives?
Absolutely. I think California has done some of this in manure methane reduction through some of these incentive programs, and I think there is a similar role that they could adopt even in terms of enteric methane solutions. But I think going back to the point that was just made, which is being able to measure and demonstrate that these incentives are working is critical, and so I think there is a roadmap. It has been done, and so enterics could easily tag on to similar things that have done.
Okay, I'm going to turn to one other quick topic before we open it back up to audience participation and some audience questions. And let's chat a little bit about the importance of insetting versus offsetting in the dairy supply chain. Because I know this is something, unfortunately, I've thought way too much about over the last 2 years, and I can see Jennifer's chomping at the bit to answer this. So share with us a little bit about insetting versus offsetting and why insetting is going to be so important in the dairy and beef sector.
Yeah, this is the bane of my existence. So when I started this Agilent project with Barry Callebaut, it was a carbon offset project. I quickly learned that that does not help the dairy sector or CPGs meet any of their goals, because when, specifically the example with manure digesters, California had this program that really helped uptake of a really good practice that reduces methane for manure management. That reduction is then being offset, which is being sold outside the supply chain. So that does nothing to reduce the Scope 3 emissions for any CPG, let alone does it help dairy reach their net zero goal by 2050. It's all being sold outside of any claim, according to all global rules. So when it comes to being able to get value from emission reductions, you want to look towards insetting. CPGs have green bonds, they've taken money out, they have thought about where to embed in a carbon-reduced product, carbon smart commodities. You know, they've thought through where the money should come from, and they will pay for these reductions. And it is where you will find the value, because it also is shared throughout the value chain when it stays within the value chain. So when you're thinking about an inset, it's really important to think that direction and not think of an offset, even though the value is there. Offsets have played their important role in teaching us how to think economically about carbon, but I think they've passed their time, and now we need to think about keeping things into the value chain and think about how that accounting works. And then specifically when it comes to the accounting is when the MRV that we've all brought up comes into factor. And that's where we need to start working on what is a third-party reasonable MRV that even small farms can play in, and how does that get transitioned with transparent data throughout the supply chain, which is where we are currently trying to build something that does that.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I think what offsets have shown for insets is there is potential for emission reduction within the supply chain, but there has to be transparency, and there has to be the same kind of rigor that we see within the offset market. So I think those are two key elements of the offset market that we can mirror in the insetting scheme as well.
Thank you. And then just a final question on incentives. And we talk about incentives. We very rarely hear dollar amounts when we talk about incentives. And what is the level of incentive that's going to be necessary to get wide-scale adoption of some of these feed additives scaled up quickly by dairy farmers and beef cattle farmers?
So I know that's one of the questions that's trying to be answered in some of the CIG studies that are going on. So I don't know it right now, but Juan will tell you in a couple years.
I could speak to that and say that it depends on the feed additive product. I mean, if you're looking at, 305 days on a feed additive for the production time in a year for a cow, I mean, you're paying per day for that product per head. And so once you add up all of that, the farmer's at a cost, let alone the additional costs that come from, as we've mentioned, the labor that goes into feeding it and all these other aspects. So you can't put a single number on it because it's going to vary based on the feed product that is being used. And that also has to be, taken into account where it's being shipped from and where it's being manufactured. And it's just a lot of variables. But when we're looking at it, I mean, there is a standard calculation that CPGs are using to calculate what their valuing is for when they create an inset project. And that's taking the highest number in an offset project and cutting it in half, because a lot of the offset projects are inflated in their value. And so I'll say that nicely. And then, so we're looking at a very reasonable amount that still does cover the farmer's efforts if it's the right product.
Okay, I think we're ready to open it up to audience participation. If there are any burning questions in the audience, we can have our panelists answer.
Thanks to the panel for your insight. Jennifer, my question is for you. There's been a lot of discussions throughout the day about MRV and measurement, and you were starting to talk a little bit about specifics about changes that you're making in this system that you're building. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what would be your wish list be if you could invent a better MRV future for your business and for this industry?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's trying to do that right now. I mean, I don't know everyone else in the audience, but I get bombarded with emails nonstop all day of someone who created a new MRV. So everyone's out there and trying to start one up and do this. I have taken, the advice we talked about where there's rigor within the offset market. So the project we created has utilized Vera's protocol, and we go through the entire Vera process and just don't register a credit, because then it becomes a carbon credit, which is then something a company can't use. And then you collect other levels of rigor and data within that process for traceability in a supply chain. So if someone created an MRV that was transparent, capable of putting a ID number on each CO2e reduction, or if we eventually get to just accounting it as methane, that'd be wonderful. But, we need to just be able to trace it completely through the supply chain down to the farmer. And so far, we've been able to build that process, but I'll say it is a little messy. You're taking data from farmers, feed mills, everyone throughout the supply chain, and also trying to work through co-ops is very difficult. This is not their specialty, and they don't have the manpower to be dealing with this. So my wish list is that, we built MRVs within co-ops that they could run and manage and be the middleman that they were designed, to be, and give them the resources and tools to succeed at that, because it's a very keen spot for them to be in the full supply chain.
I'm going to do a little follow-up on this one, and you mentioned, recognizing methane. So in your mind, should a incentive for methane be higher than a incentive for carbon dioxide reduction because of the short-lived nature and the importance it's playing in the short term? That's something either EDF or Jennifer, you can answer, I think, best.
Personally, I think the evaluation is, right now, you're going to the carbon dioxide equivalent. So we're measuring CO2e, and you pay per ton of CO2e. So overall, I think the incentive is the same, whether it's methane or carbon, because of how we're calculating. It would just take the step out of having to do the calculation within the protocol.
Do you have any more questions out in the audience? Looks like Juan's got a question.
Thank you. I have a question for Leah. I would ask you to please clarify for the audience here today the difference between functionality and safety, and GRAS exemption against the current regulatory process on functionality that allows for a claim. I know that all of this is in flux because FDA is going through that modernization effort, but from my experience, I still feel that there's a lot of confusion about those two elements, and I think you're very well positioned to clarify that.
I will do my best, Juan. So feed ingredients need to be safe for the intended use and efficacious, right? So that's the standard that we have to have no matter which regulatory review process they're going through. And the level of review and data for a GRAS, generally recognized as safe, determination, and a food additive, they should be on the same level, right? And it's just the difference is who's making that determination of the product being safe for that intended use. So is that what you wanted? Okay.
Maybe if you could just go one step deeper and say who makes the determination for GRAS as opposed to for functionality in the other way.
So with a GRAS determination, that is the company's determination that the product is safe. Okay, so it's that company, whether, and sometimes you don't have to, but you can use an expert panel to review that data and make that determination. When you go through the food additive petition process, or AFCO, which is the Association of American Feed Control Officials, the safety reviewer is FDA. And so the Center for Veterinary Medicine is the one who is reviewing that safety protocol. And with the AFCO definitions, they're looking at the conclusion, the data that's there, and saying if they have any regulatory concern with that. With the food additive, it is their determination that the product is safe, and then that gets published in the Code of Federal Regulations.
I was reminded that there's a panel on this topic tomorrow, if anyone wants more.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to ask one question regarding the commitments on the net zero of different companies. I saw in the presentation of ADF that different companies are committing, but it was not clear to me if they are committing to reduce only methane or they are committing to reduce emission across the supply chain. And do you have an idea on where those reduction will be, or is still, let's say, the overall commitment on the supply chain? But my interest is really to know where those companies are committing to reduce emissions, in which part of the supply chain is really producer-oriented, is more processing. Yeah, thank you.
There is a whole range of commitments within the science-based targets, at least, and what companies have publicly committed to. Some companies are limiting themselves to scope 1 and 2 commitments, but the ones that I showed are a list of companies that have also done scope 3 commitments, which is to say that they would work across the supply chain to reduce their emissions. And these are not methane specific, though there is one food and ag company, Danone, which is set out to commit to a methane specific reduction target, but most of them are CO2 equivalent targets. And there is also another flavor within that where some companies have set a CO2 emission intensity target, whereas others have an absolute emission reduction target. And that also varies from anywhere from 10% to net zero by a certain year in time.
I would just add, trying to decipher some of these food company claims is always somewhat challenging. There's a lot of what I call weasel words involved in some of these goals that have been set by companies, and trying to do an apples to apples comparison is really difficult. Some are looking at scope 1 and 2, some are looking across the supply chain, others are looking at carbon intensity. And it's been very challenging as we've looked at these and tried to make heads or tails for the different global food companies exactly what it is they're committing to. And I understand the reasons why they use some of the words they use, because there is a lot of uncertainty here. So to conclude the panel today, and not stand between everybody and a glass of wine, I want to ask you one final question. You can each answer it. And we've talked a lot about, obviously this is the supply chain panel, and so what's really driving in the future as we move forward the on-farm reductions? Is it going to be regulatory, heavy hand of government? Is it customers? Is it Wall Street and the fact that a lot of these customers, global food companies, have stock on the market? Or is it consumers? Or is it all of the above going forward? EDF, you want to start?
I think it's going to be all of the above. We've seen the rise of activist investors, and that's driving the investor group pressurizing companies to do more. We've seen regulators. California has regulation. There is upcoming regulation in the EU where there need to be mandatory disclosures around what their emission inventory looks like. And we are also seeing pressure from consumers. And so I think it's going to be all of these three nodes that will pressurize reductions within the supply chain.
I agree. I think all of the above is probably clear. I think the rate of adoption and applicability probably depends upon how that ask is made, right? And whose idea it is and how that's interpreted by all the way through the chain. I think no feed manufacturer wants to push these products on a producer, but we want to be able to supply them and say what they do so that when we're asked for them, we can give them to the producer.
I will also choose D, all of the above. Yeah, it's a combination of, there is some customer demand, there always is, but there is also a lot of regulatory pressure. ESG reporting is becoming really important. A lot of companies have to do an environmental audit now to, meet the needs of shareholders and investors. So there's a lot coming down from every direction, but one important one we didn't talk about was the general pressure from the supply chain for just business continuity. And that's an important one to remember too, because this is coming from all directions and all levels. It's not top down or bottom up only. And I think there's a lot of flexibility in how we look at how to implement it.